Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to take an opportunity to thank organizers for this nice chance to discuss and present the research. I think the conversation will be going on. So the paper I present today is a spin-off from a larger research project that I'm working on. Since 2014, I've been conducting research about humanitarian aid to internally displaced people in Ukraine. So that's the title that Oksana probably was referring to. The specific angle that I'm looking at is the provision, distribution, and consumption of humanitarian aid. So I spent last year and a half in Ukraine conducting the fieldwork. And as a part of it, I was tracing the circulation of aid objects, and this task led me to the areas near the contact line. And that's where I met people who live there and talked to them and interviewed them, witnessed how they learn and how their everyday life was impacted by the conflict, and how they changed their everyday practices. For instance, shutting their windows and covering their windows when the sun sets down because the shelling occurs and the light can be, identify them as potential targets. So these observations, interviews with conflict-affected people, along with the interviews with aid workers, have shaped the qualitative data set for this paper, which is, as I mentioned, a spin-off from a larger project. As an anthropologist, I'm particularly attuned to the micro level of interactions between people, their everyday practices, and accordingly how they make sense of some larger concepts and ideas such as belonging or citizenship. This paper focuses on how people conceptualize the state presence on the ground in the conflict-affected region and how they understand their place in the larger state order. And one of the central notions that I use to capture this functioning of the state is the notion of sovereignty gap. Sovereignty in its Westphalian model presumes that the state enforces order and maintains control over population in certain territories, areas that are defined by the state borders. So people and territory are two main elements of this concept of sovereignty. However, as I suggest in the paper, in the context of the conflict, it becomes more about territory than about people. The concept of sovereignty gaps highlights how the power of the state can be reduced to a narrow modality rather than being comprehensive, omnipresent, or homogeneous. Applying this notion, I argue that the life that people experience in the conflict area is marked by the stark presence of the state in the form of military forces and the state devastating absence through limitation of social and economic guarantees, or as we heard in the previous paper, access to healthcare. When talking about the conflict-affected people, we talk about 600,000 people who reside in the areas surrounding the contact line. The contact line itself is one of the defining notions for the gray zone. However, paradoxically, it has never been defined as an actual object itself. So far, there have been no walls, no barbed wires, no border signs to physically mark the separation, except for the 5 checkpoints that are used to cross the contact line. In some places, the line exists only as a matter of specific local knowledge of where the government control areas end and where the non-government control areas start. This is crucial to understand the life in the region, in the conflict-affected areas, because this artificial division can separate territories as the line on the map. However, separating families, social networks, and lives or infrastructure is not so easy, and we discussed this yesterday with Sophie's paper on the water supply system. Interestingly, infrastructure is often an invisible network that brings comfort to our lives, and it becomes highly visible only when it disappears. And this is exactly the reality of living in the conflict zone, where sudden rupture of usual services shapes people's everyday experiences. The damage of infrastructure affects the very basic needs that people have in the region. At the same time, it obtains political meanings and interpretations. Unreliable and deteriorating infrastructure is often explained as an inability of the state to fulfill its key role as a guarantor of rights to its citizens. In academic literature and international discourse, it is also known as sovereignty as responsibility. In a very extreme form, the lack or limited access to life-saving services, such as firefighters or medical assistants, underlines the lack of the state involvement, which can be contrasted with the presence of its military forces. So what does it mean to people? Not knowing if they can rely on having electricity at home or running water amplifies uncertainty. And to the large extent, uncertainty is structuring the life in the gray zone overall. As one of the informants said in the interview, we are living here always prepared to die. Because even death now is a matter of chance, of unfortunate accident, of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Lasting exposure to the dangers of active confrontations leads to the normalization of the conflict in everyday realm. People adjust their understanding of normalcy and acquire informed, if not expert, knowledge in weapon caliber or artillery distinctions. In other words, people get used to the conflict that is always on the background of their lives. The uncertainty and everyday chaos are at odds with what can be expected from the functioning state. It affects how people envision their future as well, because the horizon of expectation is very proximate and long-term planning is often simply unrealistic. The void is created by the impossibility to establish a functioning state order is partially filled by the humanitarian actors. The UN agency with other participants of WASH cluster support the repairs of critical infrastructure or work to decentralize the water supply system, which is also part of the heating system that is crucial to remember in condition of the Ukrainian winters that are lasting and freezing. And as noted by scholars of humanitarianism, the presence of humanitarian actors and their so-called interventions per se can signal about the gaps in how the state performs functions to people. The conflict has drastically redrawn the geographies of everyday practices and decreased people mobility. The problem of bad roads in Ukraine is well known, and I bet that everyone who traveled to regions in Ukraine can relate to this. The roads in the conflict zone are also affected by the movement of heavy military machines, which distract the pavement of the roads. And the repairs are very rare and insufficient to restore the conditions of the roads. And in the paper, I brought this, the quotation from one of the interviews when the person refers to the bad conditions of the road as the signal, as a metaphor of how bad the state treats its people. People's mobility in the region is also affected by mines, landmines, as Ukraine is one of the most mine-affected countries in the world. So that leads to the social isolation and to marginalization that are very much linked to the physical separation that is growing in the conflict zone as the conflict becomes more protracted. Limited ways of movement, difficulties in accessing everyday emergency services, and complications in receiving social entitlements leads to physical and social marginalization of people. So when we compare, for instance, to internally displaced people, at least they have some sort of payments to cover their utility services. People who are residing in a conflict zone are not entitled to any kind of additional social benefits or are not recognized with the special status of people who are affected by the conflict. Unequal access to resources makes people in the conflict areas more vulnerable under the overarching state strategy to restore its sovereignty in the region, which is emphasized by the presence of the military forces. As one of the ways to cope with this vulnerability is the turn or expansions of religious practices. And this is one of the possible directions to extend this research that I might explore later. But at the moment in the paper, I briefly discussed the bridge of hope, the pilgrimage road, and the series of white crosses that emerge in the landscape of the gray zone and as a call for peace and reconciliation. So to sum up, the paper addresses this idea of, by using the concept of sovereignty gaps, the paper addresses the fact that in academic literature, the current discussion of sovereignty is centered on the implicit presence of the state, whereas the lack of the state presence is not so much discussed or acknowledged. In the paper, I tend to challenge our thinking about the mechanisms of sovereignty and question the difference between the chaos and control that the state can deliver to its people. The areas of protracted and active conflict become sites that are more often than not characterized by what residents see as the absence of the state. At the same time, uncertainty and lack of social security, destructions, damaged infrastructure, disrupted transportation system, and limited social service provision, all these elements indicate not just the absence of the order, but a sovereignty gap.